So tonight we have Mike Winger. Mike Winger is going to be claiming that biblical slavery wasn't an actual thing. And apparently it was all just indentured servitude, but he has some weird arguments to get around some of the passages in the Bible. So we're going to be talking about tonight, if you would like to learn along with Mike Winger as to why there definitely was chattel slavery mentioned in the Bible and even ordained by God, then please stay tuned. Before we begin this exploration into the mind of Mike Winger, I want to clear some things up before we get into it, because I'm going to provide proof for everything that I'm about to say. I have Bible verses that prove it. I've also watched a lot of Dr. Josh Bowen on Digital Hammurabi, so it's like I slept at a Holiday Inn on this particular subject matter. So the Bible very clearly condones, regulates, and promotes the forceful subjugation of other human beings. And that's what slavery is, the forceful subjugation of other humans against their will. The Bible tells us who can be a slave and the type of slavery that they use. It's either chattel or indentured or a debt slave. The Bible even provides loopholes to make indentured servants completely slaves. The Bible also has God specifically commanding the Israelites kidnap other people of different nationalities and force them into sexual slavery. The Bible does all of these things. I say this before we get into the video because Mike is going to paint a totally different picture of the biblical narrative. And I don't want you guys to think that this is a common thought process in Christianity, because I assure you it's not. Like I said, I said all this because I'm going to prove it to you with the Bible. I'm going to prove you that Mike is wrong about this, and we're going to look at what's actually in the Bible.
Well, how did slavery exist typically in Israel back in the day? It was actually an indentured servitude. It was less than a slavery, like you are kidnapped and brought over and you're put into service. Rather, it was more of an indentured servitude, or a work for a contract period of time. It really was. It was a contracted period of time. It was voluntary rather than starving.
So to stop right here, no, they were not just indentured servants. That's just a ridiculous notion to have. In Leviticus, they plainly say that who can be used for chattel slavery. In Leviticus 25:44, it says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves." So Mike is completely wrong on this subject. This is chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is basically owning them as property. And that's exactly what the Israelites were taking part in. They had very specific laws for slaves and who you can buy as slaves and who you can't buy as slaves. So to say that only indentured servants existed is just completely disingenuous to the actual text. Another dipshit thing to say is that the Israelites didn't engage in kidnapping people and forcing them into slavery. And we're going to look at Numbers 31:9 right now. Numbers 31:9, "And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, and they took as plunder all their cattle, their flocks, and all their goods." So it was at that point, that's what the Israelites did. They brought back these things to Moses, right? Moses got really pissed off because they brought all of this shit back. And then this is what Moses said to them. "Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, why oh why would they have this particular caveat in their holy book if they had no slavery whatsoever, but yet they kidnapped after killing the entire village, which I guess you could, on a technicality, say it's not really kidnapping, but they took the virgin girls from this other nation, brought them back to Israel, and forced them into sexual slavery. And that's exactly what they did. So to suggest that the Israelites didn't partake in kidnapping of people and forcing them into slavery is just a ridiculous apologetic. Also, though, indentured slaves had a nice little hole in the law where their masters could actually force them to become a full slave. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore a hole in his ear. I'm guessing this is like one of those at-home ear-piercing things. Pierce his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Slave forever. He can't leave. Which I guess at that point, Mike would just say, oh, well, that's just voluntary forever indentured servitude, I guess. Maybe. I'm not sure. So basically, if the master wanted to keep the slave forever, all he had to do was get him another slave woman and marry him to the indentured servant, make them have kids. And then it's kind of like you either leave by yourself or you stay here with your family. If I really give you a choice between having your family and being a slave or being free, which one are you going to choose? And so it's not really a choice.
I would say hook myself up with someone who had the money. I would say I will serve you for X number of years if you provide for me housing and clothing and perhaps a wage above and beyond that.
But yeah, what he's describing here is basically indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was a thing. It did happen. But there were a lot of loopholes that would allow the indentured servant to become a slave forever.
You can think of Jacob and Laban as being an example of this. Jacob leaves, Esau is chasing him, he's got nothing, just the clothes on his back, basically. He finds Laban, he ends up coming into a 7-year contract with him. 7 years was the maximum, right? And then so he gets in the 7-year contract with him, and then he gets his pay, changes, and Laban was a bad owner. He would have been rebuked under the Old Testament law. But there's an example of how somebody moved into that position. It was caused by poverty, not racial status. It was not caused by racial status, but by poverty.
I think it's incredibly funny right here that Mike seems to choose a story to highlight how biblical slavery wasn't chattel slavery, but was indentured servitude, when Jacob is literally buying Laban's daughters with his manual labor. The text doesn't say that Rachel wanted to be with Jacob. Just that Jacob wanted Rachel, and so he became an indentured servant to buy Rachel. It's weird how you're framing this as like being in poverty, or that it was caused by poverty. It's not like Jacob was walking around in like butt naked, unable to buy clothes. He was like, oh, I guess I'll go buy a wife with my labor. No, he wasn't impoverished. He just didn't have enough money to buy a wife. If I can't go out and buy something that I want, I'm not living in poverty. It's not that I need something. It's that I want something. That's not poverty, Mike. Can you just imagine Jacob in the dirt road, kicking around fucking rocks and shit like, oh man, I don't have enough money to buy a woman. I mean, seriously, how can you defend this kind of, this garbage book? I really don't understand it. When Jacob left Laban, it wasn't necessarily because he was a bad master that would have been rebuked under the Old Testament law. At the point in time when he left Laban, he had already worked for 14 years to buy 2 wives who each had their own servant girls, which, by the way, Jacob was fucking all of them and having kids with all of them. It was only after that point where he was still working for Laban voluntarily without wanting to buy anything that he then picked up and left. So it wasn't because he was a bad owner or anything like that.
There was no rape involved in God's regulations of slavery. Firstly, because rape was punishable by death, and you had the same law for the slave as you did for the free in Israel. There was also no sex outside of marriage. So there would be no outside of marriage fornication allowed, whether they were a slave or not a slave. And if they were married, if a master or whatever you want to call him married the servant girl, then the Bible requires that he give her the full status of a wife, and he's not allowed to just divorce her. So he can't do this like one night stand kind of thing. No, but he has to give her the full status of a wife. So it actually elevated her rights dramatically.
This particular point here is again pretty hilarious because, I mean, for one thing, the men could like step outside of their marriage, which I guess technically you would have just married the servant girl or married the other girl because I mean they pretty much just had marriages going around. The Bible makes it painfully clear that slaves were not the exact same as their fellow Israelites. He's saying that there's no rape involved, but there's definitely rape involved because if you force a woman into a marriage that she doesn't necessarily consent to, that she doesn't consent to at all, if you force her into that and you force her to have sex with you, that's fucking rape, Mike. I don't know what your version of rape is, unless he's one of these kind of Christians that think that marital rape doesn't happen, which is just fucking dumb. Here in Exodus 21:32, it says, if the ox shall push a manservant or maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. In other places where it lays out where animals kill other Israelites, the master and the ox are ended up stoned. But if they kill a manservant or a maidservant or a slave in general, then they just have to pay the fee for how much they cost, indicating that they were property and not humans. It's not just that these slaves were treated as property or not as human beings, but women in general were treated as property too. Yes, slaves were literally called money, and they've been literally called property. So Exodus 20:17, this is one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's, like as in property. So the slaves were property. The wives and the children were property. That is the context in the Bible, what he's talking about.
Here's one of the laws in Israel. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. This is an important law in Israel. Kidnapping was dealt with very seriously. It wasn't a $5,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. You would die. If you kidnapped somebody, you were to be put to death, executed through capital punishment. This one law, this single law, would make New World slavery completely impossible because so much of it was fueled by kidnapping. That's Exodus 21:16.
This is not accurate whatsoever. This particular passage that he's talking about here actually only pertains to other Israelites. It was a capital punishment to kidnap other Israelites and sell them into slavery within Israel at that particular point in time. That's what that was talking about. And so it definitely was not discussing how we understand New World slavery that he's talking about to operate. Because the New World slavery would operate in the fashion of they would, in Africa, they would gather up Africans and then they would ship them back over, taking from another nation like the people to sell into slavery. Everything about the slave trade in America at that time was consistent with biblical law. So I don't know why he's trying to sort of retcon the Bible into making it seem like it wouldn't have been, because they were using the Bible in order to justify the slave trade. So I don't understand that. But the portion that he's read here is not a universal statement for either actual slaves or indentured servants. We know this because the Bible literally describes it in Deuteronomy 24:7. If a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, and if he treats him as a slave or sells him, then that thief shall die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So what it's talking about here is definitely kidnapping another Israelite and selling them into slavery in their own country. Generally, that's why like with Joseph, before the Israelites became slaves in Egypt, that's why Joseph, his brothers, kidnapped him and sold him in a different country, is because they didn't want anybody to know that they sold their brother, because that was against the law. But also, it's very important to know that these types of laws were even in existence in communities surrounding the Israelites. So if we look to the law of Hammurabi, specifically law number 14, if a man has stolen a child, he shall be put to death. So in that society, if you steal somebody of that society and sell them into slavery that is illegal. And you'll find throughout this entire thing, all of the laws that are surrounding slavery at this point in time were common across this area of the world. These were just best practices, basically, for the slave trade in the ancient world. I find it amazing how it just seems like they're pinning down these best practices for slavery, and they're trying to make it out to be like God has ordained it. Well, Mike's not, but other people are. Another interesting fact here is that the man of the household could sell his children into debt slavery. This would be him owing a debt to somebody and not being able to pay it, so he sells the children to the debt collector. And this is shown in 2 Kings 4:1, which we're not going to read. So the statement that he read is not a universal call for all kidnapping to be illegal in any kind of sense. They pretty much did this shit all the time in all of the nations surrounding Israel. This is still mostly in line with New World slavery that he's talking about, because you couldn't enslave people of that society, of like the American society. You couldn't enslave your neighbor. That was against the law. So this is still very much in line with New World slavery in its basic form. To me, it seems so far already, which we're just over 2 minutes in, it seems like he's purposefully misrepresenting the scriptures and twisting it to fit his apologetic needs. And that in itself is just disingenuous.
Notice that if you're either the kidnapper or the guy that's found with the kidnapped victim, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, he shall be put to death. So you could be the guy that has these slaves on your plantation, and you're like, well, I didn't kidnap him. Tough. This would not work. What about abuse? What about when the slaves were being abused? Well, Exodus 21, verse 26 and 27, it says, if a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, or damages their eyes so they can't see, he shall let them go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. Now, is God only concerned with eyes and teeth? Or it seems to be that the point is, if he does some sort of serious permanent bodily harm to this person, although you wouldn't consider losing a tooth to be seriously, but your point is it demonstrates abuse, then he goes free. They go free. They break the contract and they go completely free.
This was, in fact, not at all abnormal for slavery that existed around this time period. For one thing, the eyes and the teeth were very important for slaves. If you knock a slave's eye out, then, they lost their depth perception. They're not able to do their work like they once were. It's basically like a horse breaking its leg. Same thing for the teeth. If you knock a tooth out, they're probably not going to be able to eat. Also, it could get infected and they could die. So this was not so much about protecting the slave from like anything really, an abusive master or anything like that. It was more about the value of the slave as a sort of workhorse. You have to understand that the slaves that existed in Israel were kept just like all the other nations were kept, and they were forced to work like very hard labor. So we have also already extensively covered what he's describing here, and that's the kidnapping of other Israelites and forcing them into slavery. This right here is a very specific situation. Children were often sold into debt slavery. That's not indentured servitude. The children were literally sold to someone like they were cattle. The Israelites were often commanded by God to kidnap girls from other nations to force into sexual slavery. So to act like this kidnapping situation would mean that the slave owners in the South would have been killed is just bass-ackwards.
This also would be really protective and really actually elevating the rights of those who were servants during that time. Verses 20 and 21 says this, and here's one that critics will quote, and wrongly, I think. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod, so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So let me dig into this, because here's what the skeptics say. You can beat them within an inch of their life, and it's okay. You get off scot-free. But that's really not the context of the passage. Let's look at it.
It is the context of the passage. What this does not specifically entail is that beatings like this were common at the time. And that's all that it doesn't suggest. So the two laws that he's mentioning here lay the groundwork for how to properly discipline and teach your slaves. The Israelites had a very harsh corporal punishment stance on disciplining children and slaves. The whole spare the rod, spoil the child thing, or that mentality extended to both of these groups. These laws dictated how to discipline your slave by beating the shit out of him. But what it did is it allowed the slaves to continue working. It didn't damage the value of the slave. It just allowed them to actually discipline the slave. Another good thing to note here is that these types of laws were common for slave owners in surrounding nations. It was not just Israel that had these particular types of laws. Like I said before, it's really odd how all of these mandates and laws and commands of God seem to match the general best practice for the surrounding nations. It just kind of makes it seem like men were pinning these things down and saying that God is commanding them, right? Also, I really love how you claim that chattel slavery in the Bible isn't a thing, yet you read a verse that identifies the slaves by calling them property. That is just fan-fucking-tastic.
First off, if he beats a servant and they die, he shall be punished. That is the word nakam, and it's specifically used regarding the death penalty. The point here is that just because you are the quote-unquote master, you don't get off scot-free. If you kill someone, you get the death penalty, and that applies if they're a slave or if they're not. So then they go, well, but if they don't die, you can beat them with an inch of their life. Well, no, let's read this in context, because we just read a few verses back that what? If there is a beating, loss of a tooth, loss of the use of the eye, or something along those lines, they go free. So what does this verse 21 really mean? Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished. Nakam, he shall not be put to death, for he is his property. Because what's going to happen? He's going to lose this servant.
How exactly do you come to that particular fucking conclusion there, Mike? Because I really don't know why you come to that particular conclusion. I guess it's because you think that the slaves can leave at any particular time and that the Israelites won't force them back to their master or something if he just beats his slaves. Because that's not how slavery worked in Israel at all. Not even debt slaves were guaranteed to be let go after 6 years. It's in the laws, but like I said before, there are loopholes that allows them to continue to be complete slaves. Also, it's actually heavily ingrained in the Israelite society that the way that you discipline these slaves is that you beat the shit out of them. The whole spare the rod, spoil the child mentality extended to both of those groups, slaves and children. In your version of Israelite slavery or indentured servitude, there wouldn't even be indentured servitude. Like, there would be no benefit to that particular practice, because then you could just leave whenever you wanted to. For instance, if the indentured servant could just leave after supposedly being beaten, what if the slave had other slaves like beat the shit out of him and blame the master? You make it out to be like these slaves had all these protections that were also afforded to like Israelites, and they were held as far as the protective status of these indentured servants to being the same as Israelites. For indentured servants, they were Israelites, but for the actual slaves, they did not have the same status as other Israelites. They also came from other nations. So I really don't understand why you come to the conclusion that you do when it seems like the Bible totally contradicts everything that you're saying. Also, he brought up the use of nakam in there to denote that it meant to put to death, when in actuality, nakam just means vengeance. To Mike's credit, this particular word is usually used in reference to taking vengeance, meaning that you kill the other party. This particular point is kind of debated in the scholarly community, and it's really just vague. There are better words to use if you wanted to say that they will be put to death, right? There's better Hebrew words that they could have put there, but they didn't. They left it kind of ambiguous, so it's not really, at least in my opinion, you can't say that it definitely means that the punishment was death for these masters. It could have been some other kind of death. or not death, but punishment.
So there's your punishment. You just lost the money. Say you had a work contract. I'm going to give you such and such, and you're going to serve me for this much time. Well, I've defaulted the contract. Here's your money. Bye. I'm out. And so it becomes a protective device for the servants.
No, Mike. That's not how this shit works at all. You can't just retcon the Bible and make it seem like it doesn't say the horrible shit that it says. The fact remains that slaves and even debt slaves weren't just allowed to leave of their own free will. There are several sections in the Bible where it talks about indentured slaves that were let go and then later reclaimed as slaves. So it's amazing to me how you're reforming the text in order to make it suit your own apologetic needs.
Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 and 16 talk about this. It says, "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you." Let me read that again. "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place which he chooses within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him." Wow. Why would this be going on? This doesn't make sense, right? Well, it's because if the master was violating rules or being abusive or being somehow harsh or ungodly to the servant, then they could flee, and the other people in Israel are required to help them hide, to let them, oh, you want a place? Okay, let's try to help you set up a place over here, over there. That was required under this Old Testament system that is, yes, it's regulating slavery, but in a way that seems to be only meant to bring godliness into the picture, to bring protection and bring help.
So I thought you said earlier that it wasn't slavery, but then you go and read this passage and it clearly says slaves. Also, if God is good all the time and all the time God is good, then how can slavery ever really be godly if we have a correct understanding of what good is? Which good, to me, good means something completely different than what it means to you, obviously. But it just seems like really fucked up reasoning right here. I like how you're trying to downplay the slavery that's in the Bible by being like, oh, well, it was just godly slavery, as if that makes slavery any kind of better. It's still fucking slavery, Mike. Also, the passage that you're talking about here is actually referencing slaves from other nations. And this comes from a number of scholars in the field, or not in the field, but scholars in this area. These were slaves that were escaping other nations and were escaping into Israel. And so it doesn't really make sense the way you're reading it, because if it was part of the law for these slaves to escape their master and to not be forced back to their master, why would the Israelites then have to hide the slaves? Because that's what the text says, is that they were to hide the slaves and give them, they were to dwell in their midst and everything like that. So I don't understand why that would be a thing.
But now let's look at the New Testament. What about the New Testament? New Testament slavery did exist, but it wasn't a Hebrew thing. It was a Roman thing. And it didn't have the regulations of God on it at all. So there are no regulations given in the New Testament because God was not starting a nation. There was no national laws given in the New Testament, but rather individual personal laws. How should I behave? How should I behave, right? So there's advice given to those who are slaves. That is not, however, an endorsement of their slavery. For instance, we are given advice if we're persecuted. If you're persecuted, do this, do that. Does that mean that it's good for people to persecute Christians? No. And so the fact that we have advice to those who were enslaved is not an endorsement of their slavery.
Okay, so to me it seems like he thinks he's bringing up the lack of horrible slavery shit in the New Testament in order to soften the slavery that exists in the Bible otherwise. And if you do recall, Jesus said that God is the same in the past, present, and the future, right? So the God of the New Testament is going to be the same as the God of the Old Testament. God of the Old Testament definitely condones slavery. But also in the New Testament, you have several verses in there where they talk about slavers being Christian. And they talk about different laws and regulations that they are issuing to these Christian slavers. It specifically talks about how you should obey your master and how if your master is a Christian, then you should doubly be good for your master so that you can serve him better, serve God better. That's one thing. There's mixed messages in the New Testament about slavery. It definitely condones slavery, And it definitely doesn't say that slavery's bad or that it shouldn't happen. Those are the big takeaways from the New Testament. Now, the only reason, I want to get this in here, the only reason why slavery in the Bible is an issue is because the Bible is supposed to be some kind of moral foundation that we're all supposed to have, like all of humanity is supposed to have. It's supposed to be the absolute and objective moral stance to take. And so that's the only reason why this is an issue. Otherwise, in the ancient world, slavery happened. It was a shit thing. Judging it by our modern moral foundations, we can condemn it just fine. But if you're preaching from the Bible, it makes it really hard to condemn slavery. What this means is that our own moral foundation now is far better than God's moral foundation that he apparently transmitted to these Israelites.
But 1 Timothy 1:10, check this out. Here's another verse about kidnapping. It says, fornicators, sodomites, kidnappers, liars, perjurers, and if there's any other thing contrary to sound doctrine, saying the law is for these people. And who's on the list? Kidnappers. And this is a word that had the connotation of slave traders, whether that would be for a sex slave trade or for some other kind of slave trade. This is a wicked, detestable act, Old Testament through New Testament. It is something that no God-fearing Christian should ever be caught having anything to do with. And we should all be ready to stand against it if at all possible.
What I love about this particular section right here is that Mike pretty much declares that he is more moral than his own God. God-fearing Jews implemented God's laws and commandments. Those laws and commandments also included laws and commandments on slavery, to include sexual slavery through the kidnapping of young virgin girls and forcing them into marriage. Debt slavery was also a thing. Chattel slavery was definitely a thing. People were commodities to God. Even the Israelites were, but even more to the point here, he's reading from Timothy and talking about these kidnappers and slavers, but yet in other sections, which, by the way, Timothy was not written by Paul. And so the other sections that also have Paul, that were actually written by Paul, talked about slavery. Talked about these things and talked about how Christians were also masters of slaves. So I don't know why he's trying to act like Christians just weren't slaves in the Bible, or Christians weren't slave masters in the Bible. Jesus even tells the slaves to obey their masters. Not that these masters were Romans or of another faith or anything like that. It's amazing to me that Mike is totally leaving out all of these other verses and not even addressing them, not even trying to give an apologetic on them.
The scripture throughout, it condemns the elements of slavery that made slavery so wrong. The kidnapping, the forced elements of it. It condemns the violence or the abuse or the rape or the sex slavery type of stuff that's gone on. It condemns throughout all that type of thing. And then it also endorses the fact that with God, there's no partiality. There's just no partiality. Slave free, they're all the same to the Lord. And he will judge each one individually.
Okay. I've already shown you guys all of the Bible verses that totally refute everything in this particular section, because it's completely contradictory to what the Bible says. And it's pretty plain and simple. The slaves, the chattel slaves, the debt slaves, the indentured slaves, they were all seen as different. Especially the chattel slaves that were taken from other nations. Those were definitely not held at the same regard as indentured servants or other Israelites. The Bible definitely condones sexual slavery. The Bible has Moses telling the Israelites, it's a direct commandment from God to take these little girls and marry them off and force them into sexual slavery against their will. And that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about specific, like the New World slavery or how those slaves were treated or anything like that. We're talking about the subjugation of another human being against their will, forcefully. And the Bible definitely condones that shit, Mike.
Acts chapter 17, verse 26 says that God has made us all from one blood. He has made from one blood every nation of men. Every nation's been made from one blood. Even the idea of racism is kind of strange, right? Because, how many races are there? We're humans, there's that's it, we're humans. I wish we could like get on a big lineup, just everybody from like the whitest white guy in the world, like to the darkest black person on the planet, right? And then have everybody in between, like just showing there isn't this clear cut, like here's these people and here's those people and here's those. We're just this great variety of humans. And there's really no significant difference between them. None. We're all made in the image of God. And we're all made from one blood. We all come from Adam and Eve. And so that discounts the whole idea of racism, which of course fueled slavery back then.
So racism partially fueled the slave trade in Israel. If you take a look at the evolution of the concept of racism or races, back at this point in time, other races would just have been people from other nations. And like we've already covered now, they definitely stole people from other nations in order to force them into chattel slavery. Okay? It's directly right there in the Bible. So, Mike, you are completely wrong about everything that you just said. I get that he's confused as to why racism is kind of infused with slavery, but I would say that it's because of verses like Leviticus, what was it, 25:44? Because of verses like that. Because of the idea that you can take people from other nations and enslave them in yours, and it's perfectly legal in your society.
And in Leviticus 25:46, it talks about how they can be inherited by your children. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites. It separates foreigners from Israelites.
Leviticus 25:44-46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and the members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. It's a clear separation between Israelites and these chattel slaves. The masters or the head of the household could also sell their own children into slavery. You have several verses in there where it talks about the father selling the daughter off to be married, but I mean, he's literally just selling his daughter into sexual slavery. So I do want to thank everybody for joining today. I hope that you enjoyed this stream. I know it was a little dry and talking a lot about slavery and shit. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you maybe learned a little bit from it. If you did, please smash that like button. Leave me a comment afterwards with anything that I might have missed. I was kind of working off of a script, and I'm not all that fluent in the exact arguments against his, which I know that I could have just brought up several of the biblical verses in response to his, but I really wanted to drive home on the scholarly consensus of each one of these points. And so I spent a lot of time reviewing like Dr. Josh Bowen's stuff he's done on this. So the situation with slavery in Israel is a very nuanced situation. A lot of people like to take it to some extremes, like the how bad they beat their slaves and everything like that. So I really wanted to provide you guys with the best scholarly defense against Mike. And I hope that I brought that tonight. If I did, definitely let me know in the comments, share it out, all that kind of stuff. If you're going to head out or you're watching this on the replay, then I hope that you guys will stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.